An elderly black veteran sits alone on a park bench, quiet, invisible, forgotten. When police confront him and unleash a K-9, the crowd braces for tragedy. But what the dog does next stuns everyone and ignites a nationwide reckoning. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about memory, justice, and the explosive moment when truth refuses to stay silent. Before we dive into this shocking mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you love thrilling, jaw-dropping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun bled gold across the cracked pavement of Lincoln Green Park, its fading warmth brushing against the shoulders of an old man who sat quietly on a worn bench beneath a canopy of oaks. Dominic Reed, 72 years old, wrapped in a faded bomber jacket lined with a bronze star. No one cared to notice, stared ahead with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't move much, just breathed, as though even that was a defiance. His hands calloused from war and decades of forgotten labor rested on his knees. He wasn't here to disturb anyone. He wasn't here to beg. He was simply trying to exist. Yet in this city, in this country, a black man sitting still could still be mistaken for a threat. Children raced down the paths chasing kites and squeals of joy, but they gave him a wide berth. A mother tugged her daughter away as they passed him, whispering something beneath her breath. The little girl looked back, once her innocent gaze locking with Dominic's weary eyes for a second before she disappeared into her mother's fear. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn the same look in jungles thick with death. It was the look that came right before a gun was raised or a door slammed shut. The kind of fear that didn't ask questions, just judged. Dominic closed his eyes and let the sun wash over his face. It was the only thing that ever made him feel human these days. The sunlight didn't see color. It didn't question where he belonged. It just touched him as it did everyone else. And for a few seconds, as he inhaled the scent of distant pine and warm concrete, he wasn't invisible. He was just a man with memories drifting between silence and sorrow. But peace never stayed long in places like this. Not for men like him. In the distance, he heard the static buzz of a police radio. At first, he didn't flinch. He'd learned to brace himself in the quiet moments, the stillness before impact. He thought he'd left that instinct behind on foreign soil, but no. In America, the battlefield followed him home, and it wore badges now. He turned his head ever so slightly and saw them, 3 officers walking with purpose, their steps sharp, their gazes locked on him as though they'd already written the crime in their minds. Officer Sean Whitaker, the one in front, had a face carved from tired bureaucracy. Behind him, Officer Tyler Vaughn walked like a man hunting something he already hated. And the last officer, Leonard Foster, held the leash of a hulking German shepherd, taut and alert. Its ears perked as if it too had learned what kind of man to fear. Dominic exhaled slowly. So it begins. He murmured to himself, more a prayer than a warning. He remained seated, hand-still body language, non-threatening. He knew the game. Knew the cost of sudden moves. Knew what it meant when you had to carry both the burden of survival and the burden of proving you deserved to survive. They stopped a few feet away. "You've been here a while," Whitaker said flatly. "I sit here every day," Dominic replied, voice quiet but unwavering. "Just watching the world move." Vaughn scoffed. "You got ID on you." It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Dominic reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a worn wallet. Inside, folded and yellowed with time, was his Marine Corps ID. The letters Vietnam Veteran glinted faintly. Whitaker hesitated. Vaughn didn't. He barely looked at it. "Could be fake," Vaughn muttered. The words hit harder than any bullet Dominic had ever faced. A lifetime of service dismissed with a shrug. "I fought for this country," Dominic said almost to himself. "Bled for people who wouldn't shake my hand. Buried friends who didn't come back." Foster stayed silent, adjusting his grip on the leash. The dog growled low. A small crowd had begun to gather, families, teenagers, elders. People who just a moment ago had passed Dominic like a ghost were now watching him with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Dominic sat straighter, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd spent a lifetime learning how to carry fear without showing it. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "Just a little quiet. Just a place to sit." But in this world, that was too much for a black man to ask. And as the leash tightened and Vaughn stepped forward, voice raised, authority thick in his chest, Dominic looked around the park at the faces of strangers too timid to intervene and thought, "I gave them everything, and they still see me as nothing." In that moment, his stillness wasn't passive. It was resistance. It was the stance of a soldier who refused to run. And though the world forgot him, Dominic Reed, Marine survivor Elder, was about to remind them all. The breeze that had once carried the laughter of children now turned still thick, uneasy, as though the park itself sensed what was coming. Dominic Reed felt it in his chest before he saw them, the unmistakable shift in air pressure, the low hum of a police radio, and the silence that always seemed to follow when authority decided a black man was out of place. He didn't move, not because he wasn't aware, but because he knew all too well what happened when you moved, before they said you could. His body, though weathered by time, still remembered the choreography of survival: stillness, compliance, no sudden motions, no sharp replies. From across the path, 3 officers emerged, walking in that deliberate, unhurried way law enforcement does, when they've already made up their minds. Leading the pack was Officer Sean Whitaker, tall, square-jawed, with the hardened face of a man who thought fairness was the same as following the rules, even if the rules were rotten. Beside him, with a swagger that bordered on hostility, was Officer Tyler Vaughn, younger, cockier, his fingers twitching near his holster like it gave him power over everyone he passed. A few steps behind them, Officer Leonard Foster gripped the leash of his K-9 partner Shadow, a muscular German shepherd trained to bite first and be questioned later. The leash was taut already. The dog had picked up on his handler's unease. Or maybe it was something deeper, something older, something it smelled on Dominic before a word had even been spoken. Dominic didn't flinch. He kept his back straight, his hands folded over his lap. The same way he had sat through ambushes in Vietnam. The same way he had sat through 1,000 indignities since returning home from that war. He had come here for peace. But in this country, peace was not granted. It was a negotiation. And every negotiation came with suspicion when your skin was brown. Whitaker reached him first. "Evening, sir," he said with the forced politeness of a man who had already sized Dominic up and filed him under undesirable. "You've been sitting here a while?" Dominic nodded once. "Just getting some sun." Vaughn stepped in before Whitaker could reply, voice sharper, less patient. "You live around here?" Dominic turned his eyes slowly toward Vaughn. "I do. You waiting for someone?" "No." "Then why are you still here?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. People had begun to notice. A few passers-by slowed their steps. A mother pulled her toddler closer. One man pulled out his phone, holding it low but recording all the same. "I come here every day," Dominic said, his voice calm, measured. "This bench, it's where I find peace." "That," so Vaughn replied, stepping closer, his shadow falling across Dominic's feet. "Funny. Most folks don't come here to stare at trees unless they're trying to hide something." Whitaker didn't intervene. Foster said nothing, but his grip on the dog's leash tightened again. Shadow let out a low growl. "You got ID," Vaughn snapped. Dominic's jaw tensed. Here it was. The ritual, humiliation, the demand for proof of existence. Yes. "Then let's see it." Slowly, cautiously, Dominic reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not quickly, not abruptly, just carefully enough to avoid giving them a reason. He handed Vaughn his wallet. Inside was a weathered laminated Marine Corps ID, barely legible from years of folding and unfolding, but unmistakable. The words "Vietnam Veteran" glinted in the setting sun. Vaughn looked at it, then snorted. This real "it is." You could have picked this up at a pawn shop. The cruelty in Vaughn's voice was calculated, deliberate, the kind of mockery that strips away a man's worth without leaving a bruise. Dominic looked away. Not in shame, but in weariness. He'd served this country, buried friends, dodged bullets, and stitched his comrades back together with his own hands. And here he was at 72, being treated like a liar on a park bench. "I didn't come here to be believed," he said, voice cracking with quiet dignity. "I came here to breathe." Foster's dog barked once loud, jarring. The crowd jumped. A little girl let out a frightened cry. Vaughn glanced at the dog and then at Foster. "You sure this guy's clean? Maybe the dog knows something we don't." Foster hesitated. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Vaughn's eyes flared. Yet. And just like that, the threat became tangible. The leash was pulled tighter. The air crackled. Dominic remained seated still as stone, though his chest ached with the bitter truth. In a nation he'd bled for his silence was treated as defiance and his presence as provocation. He looked Vaughn squarely in the eye. Is peace only for some people, officer, or is it just not for people who look like me? Vaughn didn't answer, but the smirk on his face said everything the badge tried to hide. The heat thickened. What had started as a warm afternoon now felt suffocating, like the sun itself had turned away in shame. Tension curled in the air like smoke before fire, and Dominic Reed felt the first flickers of it burn against his skin. His heartbeat stayed steady, trained to but deep. Beneath the calm, the ache of being reduced to a problem again began to stir. It was the same ache he had carried home from Vietnam, tucked into the hollows of his chest, beside the names of men he had watched die and the silence he had learned to live with. But here, on this bench in this park, under the shadow of 3 officers, and a leashed beast, that ache was becoming something else, something raw, something rising. Sir Officer Tyler Vaughn barked louder now, posture rigid and ready. "I'm going to need you to stand up and move along, right now." Dominic didn't move. Not out of defiance, but out of disbelief, because even after all these years the rules had never changed. You're either invisible or you're a threat. And now, as dozens of eyes watched as whispers coiled through the park like warning bells, he felt himself shifting again into their target. No matter how still he sat, no matter the calm in his voice, they had already decided he didn't belong here. "I told you," Dominic said, quiet but firm. "I come here every day. I'm not hurting anyone." Vaughn stepped forward, sneering. "You've made people uncomfortable. That's enough for me." Uncomfortable. That word again. That fragile excuse America had always used to turn its gaze away. From the soldier in uniform, from the man on the bench, from the truth. The park had gone nearly silent now. A couple backed away, clutching their stroller. A teenage boy muttered, "Why they doing this?" as his friend started recording. The camera lens trembled, but the outrage in his breath was steady. Officer Sean Whitaker, still standing behind Vaughn, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. His face flickered with doubt, but his feet remained planted, bound by procedure, or maybe cowardice. Only Officer Leonard Foster, the K-9 handler, seemed uncertain. Shadow, the German shepherd at his side, strained at the leash, tense alert, snarling with anticipation. The leash, jerked in Foster's grip, taut as a wire on the edge of snapping. Vaughn raised his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You want to make this hard on yourself, old man. You think sitting quiet makes you innocent?" Dominic looked up at him, eyes weary, voice brittle but composed. "I think I've earned the right to sit anywhere in this damn country." Vaughn scoffed. "You think a dusty ID and a sob story makes you untouchable?" Dominic's hands clenched, not in rage, but in restraint. Every bone in his body told him to stay calm. But something inside, something ancient and breaking, whispered that calmness had never saved him. It only delayed the punishment. "I don't want trouble," he said louder now to the crowd, to the heavens, to himself. "But trouble keeps finding me every time I try to just be." Vaughn turned to Foster. "Let the dog check him, now." Foster hesitated. "He's not resisting. I gave you an order." That was the moment the world tilted. Foster loosened his grip on the leash. The bark came first, sharp, brutal. Then came the low growl, guttural and deep, as Shadow lunged forward. Gasps ripped through the park. A child screamed. A mother dropped her phone. The dog tore across the grass in a blur of muscle and sound jaws, bared eyes locked on Dominic. Every instinct in Dominic's body screamed to run, to shield himself, to collapse. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He rose, slowly, deliberately. The kind of rising that came from something deeper than spine or strength. The kind that came from dignity. From memory. From knowing that if they were going to try to strip him down in front of a crowd, they'd have to do it with the whole world watching. As the dog raced toward him, Dominic's eyes softened, not in fear, but in recognition. "It's me," he whispered, barely audible. "It's me, old boy." Shadow stopped, dead in his tracks. The growl faded into a whine. The rigid stance collapsed into a wagging tail. The park fell silent, stunned, paralyzed in awe. The dog inched forward, head low, sniffing Dominic's hand. Then, without command, he nuzzled into the veteran's chest, releasing a sound that could only be described as relief, recognition, love. Dominic dropped to one knee, tears brimming but unshed. "You remember," he whispered into the dog's ear. "You still remember me." The crowd gasped. Phones raised higher. Vaughn's face drained of color. Foster stepped forward, voice cracking. "How the hell?" And then through the crowd a voice boomed, with authority cutting through the tension like thunder through silence. "That man is a hero. He saved my life in Da Nang, and you're about to make the biggest mistake of yours." The park turned. A tall, broad-shouldered black man emerged from the crowd, Nathaniel Cross, his military pins gleaming in the sun eyes locked on the officers, with a fire that could burn cities. "Get your hands off him," he growled. "This ends now." And just like that, the power shifted, not with force, not with fists, but with truth, and the unbearable weight of a nation watching. The silence that followed Shadow's unexpected embrace was thunderous, a silence so loaded, so electric it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. A trained police K-9 had disobeyed a direct order, not out of confusion, but out of loyalty. To the black man the officers had tried to dehumanize. Dominic Reed, still kneeling, eyes glistening, pressed his forehead gently to the top of Shadow's head as the dog whimpered, like a lost soldier finally home. The park, stunned into stillness, became a theater of reckoning. Cell phones recorded, mouths hung open, and even the children who had been frightened moments ago stood transfixed, sensing that something far bigger than a dog and a man was unfolding before them. It was Officer Tyler Vaughn who broke the spell. His voice raw, brittle, trembling with the fury of a man who'd just lost control. "This doesn't make sense," he spat. "Dogs don't do that unless they're trained to." His accusation wasn't confusion. It was desperation. The idea that a black man could hold such respect, such history, such bond with a police dog shattered every ugly stereotype Vaughn had chosen to live by. It wasn't the dog's reaction that unsettled him. It was the truth that had just clawed its way out into the open. Dominic Reed was not the criminal here. He was the story they'd been too blind to ask about. Officer Sean Whitaker took a step back, guilt creeping into the corners of his jaw. He didn't speak, but his body did a slow retreat from the edge of complicity. He had watched this unfold, played along, when it was just another day and another uncooperative subject. But now, standing in the glow of this man's silent dignity and this animal's unshakable recognition, Whitaker couldn't meet Dominic's eyes. Foster, still gripping the end of the leash, knelt beside the dog, his voice barely audible. I've never seen him act like this. Not with anyone. He touched Shadow gently, as if trying to understand what his own heart wouldn't let him say aloud. Dominic stood slowly, the dog pressed to his side like a long-lost comrade. He faced Vaughn, squarely, voice low and full of a kind of pain that years of silence had only sharpened. "You were ready to let that dog rip me apart. Because of the way I look. Not because of what I did. Not because of who I am." He paused, but he remembered me. "And you never even asked." Vaughn's jaw flexed. "You think that's enough to prove anything?" Dominic stepped forward, his voice growing in weight and clarity. "I don't need to prove a damn thing to you. I served this country. I bled for people who wouldn't look me in the eye. I've pulled white boys out of fire with bullets in my back and prayers in my mouth. And I've lived every day since being looked at like a threat in my own homeland." The crowd murmured shock, giving way to outrage. A woman's voice cracked through the silence. "He's a veteran." "You sick a dog on a veteran?" Another man yelled. "This is what we mean when we say it's not just a few bad apples," Vaughn snapped. "We were following procedure." "No, you weren't." The voice that cut him off belonged to Nathaniel Cross, who had finally stepped between Dominic and the officers. The ribbons on his jacket, the gravel in his voice, the unmistakable presence of someone who had faced down death more times than any of them had faced accountability. It was enough to command even Vaughn's silence. "You were following your prejudice," Nathaniel said louder now, his voice rippling through the park. "You didn't see a man. You saw his skin. And when that didn't scare you enough, you brought the dog." Officer Whitaker shifted uneasily. Foster lowered his head. Vaughn, red-faced, refused to look anywhere but down. Dominic, still standing now, surrounded by a semi-circle of onlookers who had transformed from bystanders to witnesses, let out a slow breath. This is the part they don't teach you about coming home from war. That sometimes the battlefield waits for you. It doesn't end. It just puts on a badge. His words hung in the air like smoke from a final shot. A mother clutched her daughter tighter. A teenager wiped his eyes. A gray-haired man whispered, "I thought we were better than this." I really did. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Shadow himself, who sat still beside Dominic. His head bowed not in obedience but reverence. The crowd, the officers, the park itself, everything had changed. What began as another silent assault on a black man's right to exist had turned into a public unveiling of how deep the roots of suspicion go. And still through the noise, Dominic remained composed, not because he was unshaken, but because this wasn't new. It was just finally visible. In plain sight. Time fractured. The soft rustle of leaves overhead ceased. The buzz of summer insects, the distant sounds of children's laughter, even the wind itself seemed to vanish as if the world had paused in dread. In that stillness, Officer Tyler Vaughn's voice cut through like a blade. "Deploy the dog." He said it without blinking, without hesitation, without conscience. 3 words that shattered the fragile line between suspicion and sanctioned violence. Officer Leonard Foster hesitated, the leash taut in his grip, knuckles white with tension. But protocol pressure and the silence of his fellow officers cornered him. He unclipped the leash, and the dog launched. Shadow, the trained German shepherd, bolted forward like a missile loosed from restraint. Muscles rippled beneath black and tan fur jaws, parted eyes locked on one target, Dominic Reed. The park gasped in collective horror. Parents pulled their children behind them. Teenagers dropped their phones. A woman screamed. Dominic didn't move. He didn't have time to run. But more than that, he refused. His spine straightened, though the decades of wear and pain screamed against him. His feet rooted to the earth beneath him, like the trunk of an old oak that had survived every storm. And somewhere deep inside, under the years of silence, under the humiliation of being ignored, doubted, threatened, Dominic Reed remembered. He remembered the jungle, the stench of death, the sound of gunfire cracking through trees. He remembered another German shepherd, a different war, a different handler, but the same eyes. He remembered the moment when that dog had found him wounded, buried beneath mud and blood and silence, and had pulled him back from the edge of death. And he remembered the promise he'd made when he returned, "I will never run again." The dog was closing in fast, now, a blur of fury and training. And then Dominic knelt. His knees brittle, with age folded slowly, but with purpose. His arms extended, palms open in surrender, or was it invitation? His eyes locked on the charging animal. And in that heartbeat, that single breath between violence and recognition, he whispered, "Shadow, it's me." Something shifted. 10 feet away, the dog faltered. Its ears twitched. The rhythm of its steps stuttered. The snarl faded into something uncertain. 5 feet. 4. 3. Then a whimper. The canine slid to a halt just inches from Dominic's outstretched hands, tail twitching, head-tilted nose twitching rapidly, confused, curious, remembering. The silence returned thick and unbelievable. Dominic reached out slowly. His voice choked with emotion, trembled as he said, "You know me. You remember, don't you?" And then in front of dozens of stunned onlookers, cell phone cameras still rolling, Shadow let out a soft whine, stepped forward, and nuzzled into Dominic's chest. The crowd gasped. A mother covered her mouth. A teenage boy whispered, "No way." A girl sobbed. Officer Foster stumbled forward. Shadow. No heel. But the dog didn't obey. He stayed at Dominic's side, pressed into the old man's arms like a child coming home. Dominic cradled the dog's head, his own trembling, as he whispered into the thick fur, "You saved me then. You're saving me. Now." Across the lawn, Officer Vaughn's face went sheet white. His outstretched hand, still gesturing for action, dropped to his side like dead weight. His voice for once failed him. Officer Sean Whitaker, witnessing the impossible, looked down at his feet, shame spreading like a slow burn through his chest. For a moment his badge felt like lead. Foster dropped to one knee beside them, reaching out in confusion. He's never disobeyed. He's never reacted like this. Not once. Dominic raised his head, his voice firmer now, because he was trained to see the threat. But today, he saw the man. Something you all refused to do. The crowd began murmuring. The phones kept recording. The illusion had broken utterly irrevocably. This wasn't just a police encounter. This was a revelation, a reckoning, a living, breathing indictment of everything wrong with how black men are seen and not seen in the eyes of the law. And Dominic, still cradling the dog that had once been a weapon and was now a witness, looked around the park, not with fear, but with pain etched grace. "You aimed him at me like I was an animal." But he remembered I was his brother. The dog let out a low, contented sigh and leaned into Dominic's chest tail, slowly thumping against the grass. The crowd began to clap, not the soft, polite kind, but the stunned, tearful kind of applause that bubbles up when truth is finally undeniable. And in that moment, as the sun bled gold across the park, and the leash lay forgotten on the grass, Dominic Reed was no longer a man on a bench. He was the mirror to a broken system and the spark of something that might finally begin to heal it. The applause tapered into breathless silence, not from satisfaction, but from awe. What had just unfolded in that city park wasn't simply a defiance of a violent command. It was the shattering of a lie so many had clung to that justice was blind, that racism was exaggerated, that men like Dominic Reed were just imagining it all. Now standing in the center of a swelling crowd, a retired black Marine with tears drying on his cheeks and a German shepherd pressed loyally against his leg, Dominic was no longer a quiet fixture on a forgotten bench. He was a reckoning incarnate. The dog that had been trained to maim had remembered the man his handlers tried to forget, and there beneath the raw hush of stunned witnesses and trembling phones, truth stood taller than law, louder than badge, and stronger than silence. The spell was broken by a voice deep, authoritative, unwavering. That man saved my life in Vietnam. Heads turned, the crowd parted, and through that corridor of stunned silence walked Nathaniel Cross, tall and broad, his stride purposeful, eyes blazing not with anger but with unshakable conviction. His hair was peppered with gray, his military jacket decorated with medals that glinted in the sun like silent witnesses of a time too many wanted to forget. His voice, low but commanding, seemed to rise from the ground itself. In Da Nang he said, "Under fire. My leg was shattered. My squad left me for dead. And this man," he pointed directly at Dominic, "this man carried me across 3 kilometers of hell with 2 bullets in his back and 1 broken rib, just so I could live to see another sunrise." A ripple of gasps moved through the park. Officer Tyler Vaughn stepped back as if struck. Officer Sean Whitaker opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Even Officer Leonard Foster, who still crouched beside Shadow, looked up slowly, his face pale. Nathaniel's gaze swept over the officers like floodlight. "Do you know what that kind of courage looks like? Do you understand what it means to risk your life for someone who looks nothing like you, just because it's right?" He stepped beside Dominic, placing a firm, reverent hand on his shoulder. "This is what a hero looks like, not in uniform, not on a parade float, but right here in a public park, just asking to breathe without fear." Dominic stood silently beside him, but his breath was shaking. Not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of being seen, of being defended, of being remembered when the entire system had tried so hard to erase him. A woman in the crowd, maybe in her 60s, clasped a tissue to her mouth and whispered, "God forgive us." Vaughn attempted to step forward, his voice breaking. "We didn't know who he was." "No," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising like thunder. "You didn't care who he was." "That's the truth. You didn't stop to ask. You saw an old black man sitting alone and you decided he was the problem. You decided he didn't belong. That's not policing. That's profiling. And this time you tried it on a war hero." The crowd was no longer just observing, they were transforming. Outrage rippled in murmurs and headshakes, people muttering, "Disgusting, racist, shameful," under their breath and into their cameras. Whitaker's lips quivered. "We were following department guidelines." Dominic's voice finally came calm but crushing. "Don't hide behind your rules now. You didn't follow a guideline when you unhooked that dog. You followed a gut-feeling one that's been poisoned by bias for so long you can't tell the difference between procedure and prejudice." A teenage boy in the front of the crowd stepped forward. His phone still recorded, but his eyes, red and raw, were fixed on Dominic. "Sir, I never seen anything like this. I'm sorry. You don't deserve this." Dominic nodded slowly. "Thank you. But it's not just about me. It's about all of us who get looked through, labeled, treated like shadows with no stories. I survived one war to come home to another." The mother with the little girl who had earlier shielded her daughter from the tension now stepped forward and knelt beside Dominic. Her daughter held out a small flower she had picked during the chaos. "This is for you," the girl whispered, "because you're brave." Dominic's hands trembled as he accepted it, his eyes welling again, not from pain, but from something even heavier, recognition. And then, as if summoned by the moment, Shadow let out a low bark, not aggressive, not warning, but almost ceremonial, like a salute. Nathaniel looked around, his voice softening. "Let this be a moment we don't forget. Let this be the day where we stopped pretending this system is fair and started doing something about it. Because heroes like Dominic shouldn't have to prove their worth in the jaws of a dog to be treated like humans." There was no applause, no cheers, just silence. Reverent, sacred, soul-shaking silence. the kind of silence that follows truth when it crashes through comfort. And in that silence, Dominic finally felt something he hadn't in years not just seen but believed, not just protected but defended, not just a survivor but a witness of what still needs to be changed. For a long, searing moment, no one spoke. The silence in the park stretched wide, heavy with revelation judgment and the unbearable weight of truth, the kind of truth that doesn't whisper, it demands. Dominic Reed stood at the center of it all, a man once mistaken for a shadow now glowing with the gravity of lived history. Beside him, the police dog's shadow rested tail, gently thudding against the earth like a quiet drum roll for justice long denied. Across from them, the three officers stood frozen, their authority unraveling in front of dozens of recording phones and hundreds of disbelieving eyes. The illusion was gone. Their power, once unquestioned, now flickered like a dying light. Officer Sean Whitaker, the senior among them, finally moved, not forward, not away, but inward. His shoulders sagged, his eyes once fixed on maintaining control, now filled with something closer to shame. He opened his mouth, but words caught in his throat. The badge on his chest looked heavier than before, almost burdensome. He started, then stopped swallowing hard. We didn't know. Dominic turned to him, voice quiet but sharp enough to cut steel. You didn't ask. Whitaker flinched as if struck. Because that was the truth, and it was too late to unhear it. Beside him, Officer Leonard Foster crouched beside Shadowhand, hovering uncertainly over the dog's back. His face was pale eyes darting between Dominic and the leash he'd released just minutes earlier. He's never done that before. Foster said barely above a whisper. He's trained to respond to threats. He must have known. Dominic didn't answer. He didn't need to. The image alone, an elderly black veteran being embraced by a dog trained for aggression, had already spoken louder than any defense they could offer. But it was Officer Tyler Vaughn whose collapse came loudest, most volatile. He stepped back, shaking his head, sweat forming at his brow. The confidence, the smirk, the smug entitlement had vanished. In its place, confusion, fear, something bordering on panic. This isn't what it looks like, he stammered, voice cracking. We had procedure. We had calls about people loitering. This isn't about race. A woman in the crowd snapped back. Then why did you unleash a dog on a man sitting on a bench? A teenage boy shouted. Why'd you ignore his ID? And another, you knew what you were doing. The wave of outrage surged toward Vaughn like a riptide. He looked around for a way out, for some anchor to cling to, but there was none. The system he had trusted to protect him from accountability had just been exposed, and now the tide was turning. Nathaniel Cross stepped forward, eyes pinned to Vaughn's. You were ready to let that dog tear him apart because of the color of his skin. Don't insult us by pretending this was about policy. Vaughn raised a hand as if to object, but Dominic spoke again, and the weight of his words eclipsed everything else. You saw me as a problem before I ever said a word. I've been seen like that my whole life. In uniform, out of uniform, on buses, in grocery stores, on this bench. And you. Officer Vaughn saw a black man sitting quietly and decided that was dangerous enough. Vaughn's mouth opened, but no words came. His silence screamed louder than any apology could have. Whitaker finally stepped forward. Mr. Reed. His voice trembled, almost boyish, in its sudden humility. We failed you. We failed to see you. Dominic turned to him, eyes tired but not unkind. You didn't just fail me. You failed that little girl who had to watch. You failed the teenagers who now think that a badge is permission to fear. You failed your own dog, who remembered what you forgot what loyalty means. Foster looked down, overcome. Vaughn remained frozen, his face collapsing into something vacant. And then from the crowd, slowly, deliberately, came a sound, a single pair of hands clapping, then another, and another, until the park rang with a rhythm that wasn't celebration, but witness. Applause that carried no joy, only justice. A slow, powerful acknowledgement that something had cracked open and it would not be sealed shut again. The moment overwhelmed Vaughn. He turned, almost stumbling, his voice distant as he muttered, I need to call this in. Nathaniel didn't stop him. Neither did Dominic. The moment was no longer about him, it was about what he had revealed. Whitaker stepped closer to Dominic and, with the most fragile sincerity, offered his hand. Dominic looked at it, then shook it, but his eyes carried no forgiveness, only clarity. This was never about me, Dominic said. It's about who you thought I was and how many others you'll do this to if something doesn't change. And in that moment, with the sun hanging low and a nation watching through 1,000 phone screens, 3 officers stood not as enforcers of the law, but as men unraveling under the weight of the truth they tried to outrun. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long accusatory shadows across the park, as if even the daylight was bearing witness. The crowd that had once looked on with uncertain silence now stood firm, galvanized by what they had seen. Phones remained aloft, recording every moment, but no longer for curiosity now, for evidence, for history, for truth. Dominic Reed, still flanked by Shadow and Nathaniel Cross, stood in the eye of the storm with the posture of a man who had carried the weight of injustice his entire life, but had never expected the world to finally feel it too. What had begun as an ordinary day on a bench had become a confrontation with the very machinery of American policing. A moment when racism, long whispered, long ignored, had finally shown its face in plain daylight, and this time the world refused to look away. From the edge of the crowd, a young woman with tears streaking her face raised her voice. What would have happened if the dog didn't stop? If that wasn't his partner? Her voice cracked on the last word, and someone else answered before any officer could. We'd be talking about another funeral. Murmurs rippled through the park, louder now, laced with fury. Officer Sean Whitaker remained still, his face pale, his badge suddenly seeming like a confession. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence had already done enough damage. Officer Leonard Foster, still kneeling beside Shadow, looked stunned, as if even now he couldn't fully accept what had occurred. But Officer Tyler Vaughn, red-faced and rattled, attempted one last stand. We were trying to keep the park safe. Safe from what Nathaniel snapped, stepping toward him with the coiled fury of a man who'd seen this story play out too many times with a coffin at the end. From a 70-year-old black veteran sitting on a bench, you unleashed a dog on him, in front of children. And you're still standing there, asking us to believe it wasn't about race. A teenager shouted, "That's not keeping us safe, that's keeping us afraid." Another voice followed, "You picked the wrong elder, the wrong man. And now it's too late to hide." Dominic closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of justice find its rhythm around him. For so long he had been quiet. For so long he had kept his head down, hoping dignity alone would shield him from harm. But today had torn away every illusion. He had nearly been attacked by a dog whose very training was meant to protect, not prey. He had been doubted, interrogated, threatened, all for the crime of existing in public while black. And even now, as people defended him, part of him still felt that familiar ache, that hollow shame he'd carried, since returning from a war where he fought like a hero but was treated like a threat. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "I didn't come to teach anyone a lesson. I came to sit in the sun and remember the brothers I lost. But that was never allowed, was it? Not in this skin. Not in this country. I've been asked for my ID more times than I've been thanked for my service." The crowd grew quiet again, absorbing his words like a slap to the soul. "I was going to die today." He added each syllable heavy with the finality of truth. "You don't pull the leash on a dog like that unless you mean it. Don't stand here and tell me this was a misunderstanding. That was an execution on delay. And if Shadow hadn't remembered me, I'd be on the ground, not standing here." A woman near the front broke into sobs, her hands pressed to her mouth. A father pulled his son into a hug. Even Officer Foster bowed his head, eyes glassy. Nathaniel turned to the officer's voice thunderous. "We want accountability, not excuses. You're going to tell your captain, your union, your chief, and every man in that department that this city saw everything, and we're not letting it go." A young man stepped forward, holding his phone out. "I already posted the video. It's going viral. People are angry. They should be." Someone else added, "We want charges filed. We want these men off the street. They were ready to kill someone in front of our kids." And in that rising wave of collective fury, something changed, not just in the officers, not just in the park, but in the air. For the first time, Dominic wasn't the one shouldering the burden of proof. The people around him were carrying it now, demanding answers, demanding justice. Vaughn looked like he wanted to disappear. Whitaker mumbled something about needing to report the incident. Foster stood but didn't move. Shadow remained at Dominic's side, a quiet sentry whose loyalty had unraveled the entire mask of their authority. Dominic reached down and scratched the dog's ears, then looked up at the sea of faces surrounding him. "If this is the reckoning," he said softly, "then let it be the last time a man like me has to kneel to survive." And in the dying light of the day, as sirens began to echo faintly in the distance and news vans appeared like vultures on the perimeter. It was no longer a question of whether justice would come, but whether those in power were prepared to survive the truth that had finally irreversibly been unleashed. By the time the blue and red lights of backup flickered on the horizon, the park had transformed into something sacred, a place of truth of scars, laid bare of systemic rot exposed under the full light of day. Dominic Reed stood in the center still as a monument yet burning with the quiet fire of a man who had carried too many burdens alone for far too long. His journey spanning jungles drenched in blood streets lined with suspicion, and a lifetime of silent dignity had finally reached a place where silence could no longer protect him. And now, as the authorities approached, as media vans circled like hawks hungry for spectacle, a new weight settled on Dominic's chest. Not fear this time, but the unbearable gravity of being believed. The mayor arrived in a rush, flanked by advisors and aides. Her heels clicked sharply on the pavement as she pushed past the line of uniforms gathering at the edge of the crowd. She hadn't been briefed. She didn't need to be. The entire city had already seen the video. Millions had. The image of a black veteran on his knees, arms outstretched, greeting a snarling K-9 who became a whimpering brother, had detonated across the internet like a soul-level earthquake. She stopped in front of Dominic, her breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Reed," she said, voice cracking. I'm so sorry. What happened here? It's inexcusable." Dominic looked at her, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with exhaustion deeper than words. "It didn't just happen today," he said. "This moment's been building for 60 years. Behind her, Officer Sean Whitaker removed his hat and stepped forward. Gone was the posture of authority. Gone was the distant neutrality. In its place, shame, fragile and raw. "Sir," he said, trembling, "I want to say, I failed you. Not just as an officer, as a human being. I stood by when I should have spoken up. I let my silence do the talking." Dominic didn't respond at first. He studied Whitaker, his eyes searching not for guilt, but for sincerity. After a long pause, he nodded. "You did fail me. But worse, you failed yourself. You let the badge do your thinking. You let fear dress up like protocol." Whitaker's lips quivered, but he held Dominic's gaze. "I want to make it right." "It's not about making it right," Dominic said, voice steady. "It's about never letting it be wrong again." Then Officer Leonard Foster, still standing by, shadow stepped forward. His voice was brittle, barely holding. "Sir, I didn't know who you were. He swallowed hard. "I followed an order. I let the leash go. And that dog, your dog, had more humanity in him than I did." Dominic turned to him quiet for a long moment. "He remembered me," he said. "You chose not to." The words hung heavy in the air, heavier than any courtroom sentence. Suddenly, from the crowd, a voice rang out. "Hold them accountable." A wave of agreement surged. Another voice shouted, "They need to resign." A third. "No more apologies. Justice." Dominic raised a hand, not to silence them, but to center them. His voice was quiet, but carried like thunder. "You want justice, then don't let this die in a news cycle. Don't let this be just another headline. I don't want another march. I don't want another mural. I want change. I want this city to stop pretending it's surprised." He turned to the mayor, his eyes fierce with clarity. "I want policy. I want body cams that stay on. I want officers trained not just to shoot, but to see. I want someone to look at an old black man on a bench and not immediately decide he's a threat." The mayor nodded, tears in her eyes. "You have my word." Dominic shook his head slowly. "No, I don't want your word. I want your signature on legislation. I want your pen on reform. Your silence won't fix what your system broke." The moment settled into every chest in the park. Something had shifted not just in posture or words, but in spirit. Dominic's resistance, quiet, passive, patient, had become a movement of its own. No fist had been raised, no riot had broken out. But something had burned down just the same, the illusion of justice without accountability. Nathaniel stepped beside Dominic, nodding in solemn pride. "You did what none of us could. You made them see." And Dominic, weary yet anchored, simply said, "Now make them remember." The park, once just a backdrop to another act of racial profiling, had become a living courtroom. And in that courtroom the verdict was clear, not written by judges, but etched in the eyes of the people that redemption requires responsibility, and responsibility demands consequence. As the sky turned a deeper shade of gold, Dominic reached down to rest a hand on Shadow's head. The dog leaned into him, a symbol of what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. Behind him, a city braced to begin again. Morning light broke over the city like a silent promise, casting soft golden rays across the grass of Lincoln Park, where just days earlier, justice had teetered on the edge of tragedy. Now the bench where Dominic Reed once sat in quiet solitude had become something far greater, a living monument to resilience, a symbol carved not from marble, but from memory pain, and a nation's overdue reckoning. A plaque now adorned its side, glinting in the sun, in honor of Dominic Reed, U.S. Marine Survivor Witness. May no one ever sit in silence again. Beneath it flowers rested, handwritten notes, dog tags, a child's drawing of a man and a dog sitting peacefully under the trees. Shadow lay curled beneath the bench, his eyes half closed, loyal still not just to his old friend, but to the space that had once held fear and now echoed with reverence. The ceremony was modest, but the eyes of the nation were watching. What began with outrage had bloomed into movement. National broadcasts replayed the footage over and over. The dog, stopping inches from a black man, the transformation of silence into defiance, the collective breath held by an entire city. There was something timeless about it, something biblical, a reversal, a miracle. Not because a dog remembered, but because a system forgot and was finally forced to confront that fact in front of the world. Reporters asked Dominic how he felt being hailed a hero. His answer never changed. "I'm not a hero," he would say, gaze steady. "I'm a man who sat down." The hero is every person who stood up after. But inside the storm hadn't passed. Dominic still carried the scars of that day, not the physical ones, but the invisible bruises left by decades of being unseen, disrespected, criminalized in plain sight. Even now, with apologies offered, reforms drafted, and the mayor pledging citywide anti-bias training, Dominic knew that change was a long road, paved with good intentions and broken promises. He'd lived long enough to know which ones held and which ones vanished, when the cameras stopped rolling, and yet for the first time in years he felt something else too. A shift, a ripple. He saw it in the teenagers who returned to the park, not to gawk, but to learn. One boy asked him to tell the story again. "The whole thing, Mr. Reed, from the start, so we don't forget." He saw it in the mothers who brought their children to sit on the bench explaining the importance of standing for what's right. He saw it in the officer cadets who now trained with a clip of Shadow's hesitation as part of their ethics course, a moment when instinct defied instruction and remembered humanity. Shadow, too, had changed. Once a tool of authority, he now walked beside Dominic, not as a symbol of power, but of healing. Their walks became routine, quiet, respectful journeys through the same streets where Dominic once feared being stopped. Now people greeted him with nods, with gratitude, sometimes with tears. But he never let their admiration replace the truth. "Don't thank me unless you're willing to fight with me," he'd tell them. "It's not over." It wasn't. Not really. A federal investigation was now underway. Officer Vaughn had been suspended, facing public misconduct charges. Foster had requested a transfer, hoping to rebuild his life beyond that moment. Whitaker now spoke at town halls, openly admitting his complicity and urging departments across the state to rethink what they called routine. Their apologies, though not unappreciated, were not absolution. They were only the beginning. Dominic knew his time was limited. The aches in his joints, the wheeze in his lungs, they whispered reminders of mortality. But he also knew he had already done what few could. He had cracked open the wall of denial just enough for the light to come in. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees and turned the sky into fire, he sat again on the bench, Shadow's head in his lap. Nathaniel Cross joined him silent for a while, before saying, "It started with you, brother. Just sitting. Just existing." Dominic smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's the most radical thing a man like me can do." Across the park, a new generation gathered. A young black girl stood before a crowd of students reading from her phone. "We won't be silent. We won't be still. If you see something, you stand. If they doubt you, you speak. If they attack you, you remember your dignity is not negotiable." Dominic watched her heart-full eyes heavy. That was the legacy. Not the bench, not the plaque, not the video. But the fire passed forward. The courage transferred. the silence finally broken. And as night fell and the world quieted again, Dominic leaned back, eyes closed, not because he was giving in, but because he knew the next generation was already awake. The story of Dominic Reed teaches us that dignity once stripped can still be reclaimed, and that the quiet strength of a person's truth can outlast the noise of prejudice. For the elderly especially, it speaks to the deep ache of invisibility in a world that too often forgets those who sacrifice the most. But it also reminds us that time does not erase worth. Even when institutions fail and justice feels distant, a single moment, one act of memory, compassion, or courage can ripple through generations. Dominic didn't raise his voice or fight back with force. He sat. He endured. And when the world finally saw him for who he was, the revelation didn't just change policy, it changed people. The lesson is clear: no life lived with honor is ever truly forgotten, and no one is ever too old to ignite change. Even in our quietest years, we carry the power to awaken others, not by what we demand, but by what we embody: patience, truth, and the enduring belief that we matter. When dignity meets remembrance, legacies are born not in monuments, but in the hearts of those who finally learn to see. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment 1 if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.